today we will finish our story of George Washington. Last time we learned that the colonists declared their independence from England on July 4th, 1776. The King of England sent troops over to fight the colonists, and thus began the years-long Revolutionary War. George Washington led the troops in this fight, and as we saw, his bravery and his tenacity often led them to victories that they were not expected to win. So today we're going to pick up at a place called Valley Forge. The American soldiers bore much hardship. They were ragged and hungry and cold. Hardest was the winter in Valley Forge. They were so cold and hungry that they wanted to give up and go home. But Washington did not give up, and he kept them together. He starved with them and froze with them, and his soldiers loved him so much that they stayed for his sake. From farms and towns nearby, grown-ups and children came to the camp. They brought butter and ham and potatoes and all the other food they could spare. All the way from Europe, officers came to help Washington win. From France came Lafayette to fight at his side, and from Germany came General von Steuben to help him train his men. When spring came at Valley Forge, Washington mounted his snow-white horse and led his army against the English. At Monmouth in New Jersey, they fought a big battle. So well trained were the American soldiers now that the redcoats could only save themselves by flight in the darkness of the night. When the King of France heard this, he sent a great fleet and an army to help General Washington make an end to the war. With his French and American soldiers, Washington marched to Yorktown in Virginia, where Lord Cornwallis was staying with a great part of the redcoats. The French put their ships like a chain in front of the town so nobody could escape, and Washington with his men attacked from land. For 3 weeks they fought. Then Lord Cornwallis could not fight anymore. He came out from the town, handed over his sword, and surrendered with his whole army. And that was quite a victory for the colonists. But still, for a long while, the redcoats stayed in New York. At last, the peace was signed, and the redcoats made ready to sail in their ships. They were no longer enemies, and before they sailed, the English admiral asked General Washington to dine with him on his ship. When Washington came, he was greeted as the first man of a free and independent country. The redcoats bowed, and their cannons thundered as a salute. Then they took leave of each other as friends, and Washington rode home to Mount Vernon. Washington came home to Mount Vernon on Christmas Day. At the door stood Martha, his wife, with a little girl and boy at her side. They were her grandchildren who had come to live with her at Mount Vernon. With beaming faces, the servants too welcomed their master home. His tired horse got rest in the stable, and his general's uniform was hung away. As before the war, the house was filled with guests. All his friends and relatives, and also many people he did not know, came to thank him for what he had done for America. Now Washington was happy. He walked peacefully over his fields. He watched the plants shoot up from the soil in the strong Virginia sun, while his step-grandchildren played around him. Once again, he was Farmer Washington, and that was what he liked best to be. But the Americans needed a man to rule over them instead of the English king, and they said, "George Washington led us to freedom. He is the first man in the country, and he shall be our president." Never before had there been such celebrations in the country as when George Washington drove to New York and was inaugurated as the first president of the United States of America. For 8 years he was president and led his countrymen wisely and justly, and the country grew strong and rich. It was he who founded and planned the town of Washington, with the Capitol and the White House, and all his countrymen honored and loved him. The little boy from the lone Virginia plantation had become the father of his country. And that is the story of George Washington, the first president of the United States.